back in 2005-06, in a couple of people mentioned it, I and my group of malcontents wrote a publication called Culture Shock, which was about, ostensibly about, how could the cultural sector be used to get people to cross cultural boundaries between one another. So most people have been used to working with this group over here, and then they stop working with that group, and then they go work with this group over here. But they never got those groups to talk to one another. So Culture Shock was all about trying to get that kind of cross-fertilisation and the way that the cultural sector could encourage that, because we thought at the time, and I still think, that part of what the cultural sector does is decode cultures and explain them to people. So in the past they've done that for the Romans and the Egyptians and other things like that, but they never really bothered with doing it for modern cultures. So we thought, well, can you apply those skills to modern cultures and see what comes out of it? And like is the want of a think tank, we went around hawking this idea to lots of people in the cultural sector and found some very willing and some unwilling candidates to take it forward. Tyne and their partners were probably the most willing, and I think that shows in the project, which I'll come to in a minute. I'll trouble you with one anecdote before I start talking about my speech proper. There were some unwilling ones. There was one museum, which I won't mention, which said, oh, that looks really interesting, Chris, come and have a chat. So I went to have a chat with the director and the director of learning of this particular museum. And they said, yeah, that looks really interesting. We'll have a natty with our staff and the teams and the people who we need to make this work, and we'll come back to you. And in the meantime, other people have been popping up and saying, yeah, that looks really interesting, let's go and do something with that. So we've been working with them. And I thought after a couple of months had passed, I thought, well, that's been a bit silent from them, I'll give them a ring. So I rang them up, and they said, oh, yes, well, the problem was that the curatorial teams didn't want to do anything within 10 generations of modern life, because somebody who's still living might pop up and disagree with them. And I went, well, that's an interesting response for a major museum, which I won't mention. So there were people for whom this kind of work is a serious challenge, and we'll get to that in a minute, so I'll explain some of the challenges to the organisations present. And there are organisations who go, right, this is a serious challenge, let's have a think about that, and let's change and evolve and adapt and see what we can get out of it. And Tyne and Weir is a good example of that. And there are those museums who get terribly defensive and go, oh no, this is all new, we're not used to doing this, and we don't want to do it. So, I'm glad to be speaking about an institution which did think the ideas were worth having a go at, and let's see what turned out of it. Well, I've explained a little bit about who I am, which probably gave you the impression that we're natural candidates for a conference session called Why Bother? We ask that kind of question all the time. What's the point? So the subtitle of this is going to be What's the point through most of this talk. So if you're an individual, why would you be interested in hearing or telling a digital story? What's the point for you? If you're an organisation, you've got enough to do, haven't you? Why do you want to bother with this stuff? So these are the kinds of questions we started asking as part of evaluating this. And we've been on a journey with this team for a good number of years to try and unravel that. So in the beginning, the simple contract was the partners here asked us to evaluate this project. So I shall explain what that means. These are the people we looked at. So we looked at the people who made the stories and their friends and families. There were a couple of thousand of those. The organisations that ran the project, so that's the museum partners, but it's also the people that bankrolled it. You've heard about some of those already. And those with a political or policy agenda attached to it. So there were some government agencies, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and other agencies that are interested in the policy implications of a project like this. Just a handful of those. And then there were the people who watched the stories, or otherwise came into contact with them,
and there are nearly 40,000 of those, so that took some chewing over, trying to get some answers from them. Let's look at participants first. I think perhaps the most profound thing that came out of this for us was that this project valued people in a way that public services generally don't. And what I mean by that is, you heard from Pip this morning of people's experience of the healthcare sector. We have this great, enormous institution which doesn't treat you as a person, although in the NHS's case, it was supposed to be set up to do that, but it doesn't really act in that way. And the rest of the public sector is guilty of that in many instances too. So people get more used to being herded around decisions that have already been made, or patronised, or ignored, or all three of those, or many more things. And then politicians wonder why the electorate aren't bothered anymore. And culture shock was something else, because it asked, and this touches on what Barry said, this asks, what do you want to say about stuff that interests you? Which is completely materially different from the way most agencies and most authorities act, because what they mostly ask, and you might think about this in your own practice, what they mostly ask is, what do you think about stuff that interests us? Which is an entirely different question. So in museums' case, for example, you go to a museum and you get surveyed about what you think. But no one asks you before you come in what you're interested in and shapes the service around that. They mostly produce something like an exhibition, and then they get a bit of feedback, and sometimes it makes a difference to the next exhibition, but sometimes it doesn't. So that the kind of question that Culture Shock asks, by starting with a person and saying, look, forget all of that. I've left my organisational agenda outside the room. I want you to tell me about what interests you, is an entirely different question. And that showed. We didn't ask that question specifically in any of the evaluation research we did, and yet 36% of all the people we talked to described being valued like they hadn't been for many, many years. That's why I've used this quote. And 36%, I don't know whether you think that's a high figure or a low figure. I was completely astonished by that. I was expecting it to be 3%. But the effect this has had, because it gives people an opportunity to say what they care about, rather than comment on something that you do, is materially different and fantastic. People felt valued, I think, because they were asked about themselves, but they also felt valued because an organisation they trusted was doing the asking. Now, if you look at American research, they do this thing called Veracity Index every year, where they go and ask people who are the professions, who are the individuals, who are the organisations that you most trust. Doctors, medics, surgeons, hospitals come out at the top. No surprise, possibly. 92% veracity. Guess who comes next? I'll tell you. Museums. That's a bit of a surprise, isn't it? 87% of people trust museums. And part of the way that people react to this project has been because somebody they trust is asking them. So what that made me think was, would this work as well if you just gave it to a local authority and they did the asking? Answer, probably not. Because people are very conscious of the kind of organisation that's doing the asking. So you might like to think about your own organisation and its veracity, to use the American terminology, how much it's trusted before you embark on this kind of work, because it will make a difference to the way people perceive it. And lastly, I think people responded to this particular project because the staff involved, who had been through the process, handled it sensitively and with a degree of humility of the kind that Pitt was describing in the healthcare sector earlier. I think people rediscovering that they mattered in the world made us quite cross, actually. Like they become, I'm talking about people in this city at the moment. I'll have to talk about people in this city because that's what we were evaluating. But it was like people had become bystanders in their own lives, kind of flotsam and jetsam on a sea of decisions made without them. And that surprised me and made me a bit cross, because they'd had their confidence and their self-esteem beaten up so badly that this project was a revelation. Now, I had much rather it hadn't been a revelation, because they were used to being asked about what matters to them and what they care about, and getting those things into the public debate and making a difference to the services that they get provided with. But they weren't. So this was a revelation from that point of view, which made me a bit sad. And then I remembered that digital storytelling has its roots in the social justice movement. And I thought, well, no wonder. Because it's about, most of the things that you've heard this morning is about giving a voice to people who are marginalised or dispossessed or otherwise don't have a voice as much as they might in the society in which we all live. So we asked after that, well, were these features something unique? Forgive me, Barry, but I had to ask the question, is digital storytelling something that is unique to that, or can it be done using something else? Or as one of my team more prosaically put it, was Culture Shock anything more than YouTube on steroids? Was it just the fact that people could make their story, put it on the web, and get their mates to watch it and feel good about it, the thing that mattered? Was that enough? So we needed to know about that, so we did a bit more digging. And what we found was that as well as being heard again, people had lots and lots of personal epiphanies along the way. And they used loads of adjectives to describe that. Learning, self-belief, satisfaction, joy, happiness, pride. They used pride a lot in this region. So for someone who comes from Cornwall, we had to do a lot of unravelling of what they actually meant by that. But all sorts of adjectives to describe a journey of self-discovery. And the reason for that seemed to us to be that it was a combination of quite a cathartic process, where you could spill your life into this digital system, but also a credible product. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about an organisation that people trusted asking the question. Because what the museum was saying is, we'll apply some production values and some editing, and we'll put it out in public domain, and we'll keep it forever. So it was a credible product, which wasn't like going to an evening class or something like that, where you mostly do your art and then at the end of it somebody gives it you back. So this was very different from that point of view. And the process was both individual and social, as Barry was describing. The group part of it was really important. And it was also self-directed, but also supportive. So you got to make your story, but the staff were there to support you, and the rest of the group was there too. And it was one in which people were saying, by implication, we think this is so important, we're going to keep this story forever. These kinds of epiphanies came out of the personal and emotional nature of the stories, which you've heard some about this morning. And it was littered with kind of personal discovery and restorative therapeutic effects. They were all very clear. And plenty of people faced demons of varying sizes for the first time, or in Pip's case, dragons. The same thing, a monster of some description. And getting over that was the point for participants. So it was pretty clear very early on what the point for individuals was. But what about the organisations that made it happen in the first place? We have to ask that question, because if the organisations don't behave in a way in which this matters in the future, probably not going to do it again. So we needed to ask that question, but before we or they could figure it out, they had to get to grips with the challenges of digital storytelling and some of the questions that it exposed.